When Rich Lady flung mud at Big Shaq, she thought it was just a careless splash, an accident washed away by luxury. But the next morning, 4 convoys of 10 matte black SUVs each rolled across her lawn, silent yet heavy with purpose. This wasn't gossip. It was history's reckoning coming to her doorstep. Get ready for the storm that proves you don't mess with Big Shaq, and walk away unscathed. Before we deep dive into this interesting story, subscribe to our channel, and tell us where are you watching from. Share in the comments below. In the town of Willcroft, Georgia, where Spanish moss clung to the limbs of live oaks like secrets too old to speak, a man walked like time didn't own him. Donovan Big Big Shaquille O'Neal, known simply as Big Big Shaq to the ones who loved him, and Big Big to those who didn't know him well enough, moved through the streets as if the earth curved slightly to greet his feet. He wasn't in a hurry. He never was. Not because he couldn't be, because he chose not to be. People here didn't just recognize him, they adjusted to him. He was like sunrise, constant, commanding, and never boastful about it. Despite the millions he'd earned off real estate, tech patents, and a logistics company that powered half the Southeast, he dressed like the man who swept floors at the local mechanics. His boots were worn, his jeans faded, and his shirts always pressed as if honor lived in neat seam. Most folks in Willcroft didn't know the full length of his bank account, but they knew the weight of his presence. He wasn't a man of many words, but when he did speak, his voice carried low, rich, and slow like thunder just beginning to form. He lived on the edge of town in an old farmhouse set back from the road, painted soft gray with white trim, nothing flashy. If you looked close, you'd see the security cameras tucked under the awning, the discreet guard post hidden in the woods, but no one ever felt watched. They felt safe. Kids rode their bikes past his house like it was a lighthouse. Teenagers trying to sneak out late at night often found Shaq sitting on his porch swing, nodding slowly, like he'd seen the same rebellion decades ago and decided not to stop it, just to let the world teach you. Every morning, just after 6, Big Big Shaq would leave his house and walk. Not jog, not drive, walk. Past the old cemetery, past the corner store that opened early just for him, past the homes with flickering porch lights and sleeping dogs. He greeted Govern, not with empty how you doin's but with honest eyes. He saw folks, he saw through them too, and that's what unnerved people, especially the ones who couldn't hide behind their titles, their bank accounts, or their skin color, when Shaq looked at them. Despite his wealth, Shaq refused to build fences. "If you build a wall around your heart," he once said to the preacher's boy, "you'll eventually forget who you were trying to keep out, and you'll keep yourself in instead." At the Willcroft Rec Center, he was a legend. Not for how much he gave, but how much he stayed. Every Thanksgiving he'd cook himself, his mama's recipes with tweaks of his own, and serve without cameras. He ran a scholarship nobody knew he funded, paid off hospital bills in cash, paid attention to kids nobody else listened to. He didn't care if they became doctors or plumbers. He just cared they believed they could become something. But here's the thing about being good without asking for thanks. It makes you invisible to the ones who expect power to scream. That's why when Shaq entered Oak Ridge Country Market one Tuesday morning in his usual work jacket, carrying a canvas bag of donations for the food bank, the woman at the counter didn't recognize him. She didn't know the man who once saved her brother's failing business with a silent loan. She saw worn boots, dark skin, and a man who took up more space than she thought he should. She called the manager. The manager looked up and immediately paled, stammering to apologize. But Shaq held up a hand, calm, unshaken. "Let her learn," he said. Then he left. He wasn't easily offended. But he remembered, not out of spite, but because he understood the importance of truth. People needed to see themselves reflected back, even if the mirror cracked a little. Shaq's mother, Lucille O'Neal, taught him that. A former schoolteacher who read poetry like it was gospel, Lucille raised him to love fiercely, forgive slowly, and walk like God laid the earth just for his steps. She lived down the road in a sun-bright cottage with yellow shutters and a porch full of rocking chairs. Every Sunday, no matter how busy he got, Shaq would eat brunch with her. Grits, smoked fish, greens, sweet tea, and while she never asked about his business, she always asked about his heart. "You carrying too much again, son?" she'd say, peering at him like only mothers can. And Shaq, all 6'6" and 280 pounds of him, would nod like a boy too proud to cry. She was the only one who called him Donovan. Everyone else Big Big or Big Big Shaq, depending on how much history they shared. Willcroft had changed since Shaq's youth. Gentrification crept like kudzu across the old brick buildings. Houses once filled with stories were now heirlooms with minimalist decor. The church bells still rang, but fewer people listened. There was a shiny new civic center now, run by donors who rarely set foot past the garden district. But Shaq remained. He anchored the town in a time when roots still meant something. Still, not everyone respected Roots. There were whispers about him, of course. How someone with that kind of money still shopped at the same barbershop. Why he didn't move to Atlanta. Why he spent time with those people on the South Side. But Shaq didn't waste energy on whispers. He spent it on legacy. He had a daughter, Mamara O'Neill, in her final year at Howard Law. A fierce mind, a sharper tongue, and a heart as full as her father's. She rarely came to Willcroft anymore, not because she didn't love it, but because the world was calling, and her father had always told her go where you're needed, not just where you're wanted. Shaq's wife, Shawnee, lived in the city, in a brownstone she designed herself. They loved each other, but they loved each other differently now. Grown love. Space-bound. Rooted but roaming. They spoke twice a week, shared holidays, and respected what life had become. Not every love story ends with white fences. Some end with mutual peace. Shaq's days were full, but quiet. He didn't seek the spotlight. He avoided cameras. He believed that goodness when advertised starts charging admission. But beneath all that calm, beneath the polished eyes and heavy hands, there was a storm Shaq had learned to manage. He'd seen the way power could rot a man. He'd been in boardrooms where his skin became the topic. He'd been in meetings where his silence was mistaken for ignorance. And he'd walked out of each one holding more than they ever could, the knowledge of who he was. People underestimated him. That was their first mistake. But the second? That would come later. Because Willcroft was about to witness a moment that would test everything it thought it knew about power, dignity, and what a man can do when you forget to see him as a man. It would start with a simple act, a passing car, a splash of mud, a face behind the wheel, too busy looking ahead to see who she left behind. But Shaq would remember, and what followed would not be revenge. It would be a reckoning. The sun had risen crisp over Willcroft that morning, warming the pavement just enough to release the scent of dew-soaked pine and yesterday's rain. Magnolia Lane, named for the aging trees lining its edge like a slow-dancing choir, was unusually quiet. The kind of quiet where you could hear the flap of a bird's wings and the roll of a rubber sole against gravel. Big Shaq, real name Donovan Shaquille O'Neal, was on his way home from the food pantry, hands still faintly dusted with flour and canned tomato juice. His canvas bag hung from his thick shoulder, filled not with groceries for himself, but with donated essentials he had promised to deliver to a single mother over on Candlewick Street. He walked with that same patient cadence, Willcroft knew well. Shoulders relaxed, eyes slightly downcast, not in defeat, but in focus, watching his steps as if each one was a signature on some invisible promise to his town. The morning felt generous, the breeze polite, and the sidewalk dry from the earlier sun. That mattered to him. Shaq always liked to walk home clean. Crisp shirt, dark slacks, boots shined with oil and cloth. He'd gotten them polished by Malcolm Jr. behind the laundromat. Told the boy he believed in his hustle, gave him a tip that would have paid for half the kid's rent. It wasn't about the shine, it was about the dignity. Then came the sound. A deep guttural purr first, then a high-pitched squeal of acceleration that cut through the stillness like a blade through soft fruit. It echoed off the brick walls, and startled a pair of crows from a telephone line. Shaq looked up just as the car, a white Bentley Bentayga, spotless and smug, whipped the corner with too much nerve and too little grace. Its tires hissed against the edge of a roadside puddle, left behind from a broken sprinkler pipe no one had gotten around to fixing. The splash was instant. A thick sheet of muddy water rose like a wave, and landed across Shaq's chest, coating him in a cascade of brown blotches. His pressed shirt soaked through, his slacks stained, and his boots, Malcolm Jr.'s proud work, dripped with red clay filth. The Bentley didn't slow. If anything, it accelerated. As it passed, a pair of expensive sunglasses caught the sun through the tinted driver's side window, the only glimpse Shaq caught of the woman inside. The flash of platinum blonde hair, a gloved hand adjusting something on the dashboard. No brake lights, no turn of the head. Her name was Celeste Vangrier, heiress to the Vangrier Textiles fortune, current president of the Willcroft Arts and Culture Trust, an unofficial queen of Willcroft's elite social circle. Her face was often on posters for galas and symphony balls. The same posters Shaq helped hang around the community centers, without ever bothering to attend the events themselves. Celeste was polished, precise, and entirely disconnected from anything below the Garden District. She liked charity, she just didn't like the people she gave to. But that morning, she hadn't seen Shaq. Or maybe she had. That was the question that would ripple through the town by sundown, because someone was watching. From the porch of Miss Elvira's Tea and Stitch, tucked behind a row of crepe myrtles and wind chimes, a man named Lamont Harlan sipped from a thermos, and saw the whole thing. Lamont was a retired trucker, local chess master, and the town's quiet recorder of everything people thought nobody noticed. He didn't say a word as he watched the mud hit Shaq like a silent slap, didn't move when the Bentley sped off, but something shifted behind his eyes, like a camera shutter closing over judgment. Shaq stood there, still dripping, still calm. He didn't wipe at the mud. He just looked down at his boots, at the ruined shine, then turned his gaze toward the horizon, where the Bentley had disappeared. He exhaled slow, through his nose, the way you do when you've been reminded again of a truth you'd hoped had changed. He didn't yell, didn't raise a fist, didn't run after the car. He simply picked up his bag from where it had dropped, adjusted his shoulders, and resumed walking, wet, but not small. Humiliated, perhaps, but not broken. Shaq wasn't the kind of man who chased apologies, but that didn't mean he forgot injustices, especially the quiet ones, the ones no jury would ever convict, the ones that always seemed to pass without consequence. By noon, word had started to spread, not by social media or news alerts, but by breath and eyebrow and phone call. Willcroft's gossip vine was faster than 5G. The version changed depending on who was telling it. Some said the Bentley did it on purpose. Others said Celeste probably didn't see him. A few claimed she'd laughed when it happened, though no one could prove that. But all of them agreed on one thing. You don't do that to Big Shaq. Because even if you didn't know he was rich, really rich, you knew he was right. And there's a currency to that kind of man in a town built on contradictions. At the country club, the whispers turned cautious. Celeste had arrived, just after the splash, untouched, immaculate in her linen suit, laughing about the puddle problem on the east side. No one mentioned what had just happened, not to her face, but later in the club's powder room. Delilah Mortwin, wife of a retired judge, muttered under her breath to no one in particular. She doesn't even know who she just disrespected. At the Willcroft Library, where Shaq quietly funded the children's literacy wing, Miss Dorina, an elderly librarian, with eyes like magnifying glass lenses, refused to mention the incident directly. But she kept glancing out the window toward Magnolia Lane, as if waiting for something to return, a reckoning perhaps. The only one not visibly moved by it all was Shaq himself. He returned home, changed into clean clothes, and drove across town to deliver the supplies. He didn't mention the splash, didn't complain, but when he polished his boots again that evening, there was a new tension in the way the cloth moved, a small crease in the fabric of his restraint. See, Willcroft knew its history. It knew the weight of mud, not just on boots, but on names. It knew that dignity once stripped had a way of rewriting stories. The town also knew that while Big Shaq never retaliated, the world around him had a way of responding for him. What no one knew, not even Shaq, was that this moment, one careless splash of muddy water, was about to tilt Willcroft off its polished axis. Because sometimes the things people ignore echo louder than the things they shout, and sometimes a man who walks without raising his voice is the very storm you never see coming. Shaq had been tested before. Boardroom deals sabotaged, restaurant tables not offered, news interviews edited to change his meaning. But always, he chose grace. Not because he was passive, but because he understood power didn't need to announce itself. But this was different. This was public. This was personal. And most of all, this was seen. Because the next morning, before the sun even cleared the roofs of the old parish buildings, 4 matte black convoys of 10 SUVs each rolled into Willcroft from 4 directions. No sirens, no spotlights, just presence, just silence heavy enough to crush teeth. And by the time Celeste Vangrier stepped out onto her front steps, sipping espresso in a robe made of imported silk, she realized too late that mud washes off, but consequences do not. By the time the sun dipped behind the oak curtain of Willcroft's west side, the splash itself had already become old news, not because it didn't matter, but because of who it happened to. Mud dries, but the story of a woman like Celeste Vangrier, disrespecting a man like Big Shaq, doesn't settle quietly into dust. It seeps into floorboards, slips into backroom conversations, and re-emerges in every corner of a town that knows its own reflection better than it admits. The first whispers began in Oak Ridge, the oldest part of town, the beating, whispering heart of Willcroft, tucked behind the shiny veneer of new developments and civic centers. Oak Ridge didn't have gated communities or valet parking, but it had something stronger: memory. Generations lived and died on those porches, under rusted ceiling fans and painted house numbers long faded by heat. And in Oak Ridge, people didn't just talk. They watched, they listened, and they knew when a line had been crossed. At Tony Dell's barbershop, where debates were sharper than the razors, and the smell of sandalwood hung heavy in the air, the splash came up before the first taper fade was halfway done. Tony was clipping a teacher named Elwood when the bell over the door jingled, and in came Bucky James, local postman and trusted carrier of both envelopes and town secrets. He didn't waste time. She splashed him, Bucky said. Didn't stop. Bentley didn't even hesitate. Tony didn't stop cutting. Big? Bucky nodded. That was all it took. The shop fell quiet for a beat. No one spoke, but the silence was sharp. Then came the reactions: half laughs, sucked teeth, a murmured, "Lord, she done picked the wrong one." It wasn't about the Bentley, or the puddle, or even Celeste herself. It was about a boundary, an invisible thread of respect that ran through Willcroft's streets, one you didn't cross without consequence. And Big Shaq, he wasn't just respected, he was foundational. He was one of those men you didn't mess with, because messing with him meant disturbing the very balance of how things held together in the town. You didn't toss mud at a man who had quietly paid off mortgages, saved sons from jail time, rebuilt burned-down churches without so much as a press photo to his name. News drifted from the barber shop to the back steps of First Mount Grace Church, where Deacon Hall leaned against the brick wall, shelling peanuts with his thumb, listening as choir director Miss Dina told it her way. She didn't even roll her window down, Deek. Just kept going, like he was invisible. The deacon didn't flinch. Folk don't see what they can't understand. Dina narrowed her eyes, or what they choose not to. The splash had become a parable by noon. In the country club kitchen, beneath the chandeliers and above the fryer grease, line cooks whispered about what might happen next. Ramon, the sous chef, had seen Celeste walk in earlier with her usual air of scented detachment, but this time, something was off. Her shoulders tense, eyes flicking. She was waiting for a reaction she didn't fully understand. Like a chess player making a move without grasping the rules of the game. But the game wasn't hers to play. It belonged to Willcroft. And Willcroft had long memory. The whispers became phone calls. And not the kind you heard ringing in public. These were the kind that traveled on silent tones, through encrypted lines, to people who didn't answer unless the world tilted. People like Judge Ellis Thorne, who sat in his leather library chair that evening, swirling bourbon but not sipping, his eyes locked on the screen of a single text. He got hit. Magnolia Lane. No apology. You know what time it is. Thorne didn't need more context. He'd known Shaq since his law school days, back when he'd nearly dropped out after a scandal threatened to ruin his career. It was Shaq who'd made the call, paid for the firm, and whispered only one thing: "Don't owe me, remember me." And Thorne had remembered, quietly, until now. In a condo overlooking the bay in Savannah, Ada Monroe, now head of Monroe Developments, paused a board meeting, mid-slide. She excused herself, stared at the message on her phone, and sat down slowly. She was a woman who hadn't cried in 15 years, but she felt her throat tighten. Shaq had once loaned her the startup money that made Monroe Developments a reality. She'd been a waitress, a single mother, a dreamer, no leverage. He'd seen something in her that no banker did. Her debt wasn't financial. It was moral. And now, that account had come due. On the outskirts of Atlanta, Reverend Dr. Carlton Royce, pastor to senators and civil rights icon in waiting, stood in his prayer garden when his phone buzzed. His assistant said it was urgent. One word came through: Shaq. Royce closed his Bible. Shaq had once pulled him out of addiction, quite literally drove him to a retreat in Tennessee, stayed with him for a week, cooked his meals, read scripture out loud even when Royce cursed him out. Royce had never forgotten, couldn't forget, because the man who had walked with him through his darkest hour had just been splashed like he was a nobody. By midnight, 4 separate calls had been made. No group chat. No broadcast. These were private oaths reignited in silence. Not to bring violence, but to bring balance. And somewhere deep in the Willcroft Hills, beyond the sightlines of drone-captured real estate footage, a ledger was opened. Not one of numbers but of promises. Shaq never asked for payback, but that didn't mean it wouldn't come. Meanwhile, back in town, Shaq carried on. He'd attended a community meeting that evening, sat on the folding chairs in the back, nodded at budget reports and youth program proposals. When someone asked if he was all right, he just smiled. But behind that calm exterior, something had shifted. Not anger, not vengeance, just a kind of alignment, like someone placing the final stone in a long-forgotten path. Oakridge held its breath. Because Oakridge knew something was coming. It was in the way the streetlights flickered longer than usual. In the way Miss Lucille watered her hydrangeas with a furrowed brow. In the way kids, without knowing why, started coming home earlier. Celeste Vangrier, meanwhile, was preparing for the annual Founders Gala. Her team had spent the day finalizing seating charts and wine pairings. She had not yet realized that she had become the talk of a town that didn't forgive silently. She assumed her splash had landed on a nobody. She didn't understand that the mud had struck not just a man but a symbol. And in Willcroft, symbols moved people. The town hadn't erupted. There were no protests, no breaking news segments, no confrontation in the street. But what did erupt was something more dangerous. Respect reshaping into response. The kind you couldn't predict. The kind that came quietly at first, until it didn't. And so, on the eve of what Willcroft would later call the turning, 4 powerful figures, each in different cities, each in different chapters of life, packed bags, cleared schedules, and quietly instructed drivers to prepare long rides. No one gave interviews. No one tipped the press. But Oakridge knew the sound of justice when it started to stir. And in the house at the edge of town, under a silver Georgia moon, Shaq stood at his window, watching the wind rustle the pecan trees in his front yard. He said nothing, but his silence wasn't empty. It was waiting, because he knew what Oakridge knew. You don't have to chase the storm. Sometimes it finds you. The morning in North Willcroft Hills began like any other sunlight, crawling across marble countertops, birdsong echoing softly through double-paned windows, and the faint clink of silver spoons against fine bone china. Inside the Vangrier estate, everything moved in perfect order. The help arrived on time. The gardener clipped the lavender hedges into their manicured cubes. The espresso machine hissed its morning rhythm. For Celeste Vangrier, routine wasn't luxury, it was armor, ritual, precision, every second calibrated to affirm her place in a world she believed she'd earned. She stood near the grand window, overlooking her circular driveway, wrapped in a robe woven from Egyptian cotton, her eyes scanning her phone. Emails, event confirmations, a note from her assistant reminding her of the Founders Gala guest list. Her thumbs tapped with graceful speed, responding with curated warmth. Somewhere in the kitchen, her chef plated her fruit parfait. No bananas, extra pomegranate. Everything, from the polished walls to the imported orchids in her foyer, whispered of a life untouched by disorder. Then the hum began. Low at first. Mechanical. Distant. She didn't look up. Probably construction trucks again. Then it grew louder, thicker, like thunder swallowed by leather and steel. She furrowed her brow and turned toward the window. And that's when she saw it. A line of 4 matte black SUV convoys, 10 vehicles each, moving in calculated unison. No sirens, no decals, no signals, just silent authority. They didn't race. They arrived. The first vehicle curved smoothly into her driveway, tires kissing the cobblestone with reverent weight. Then the second, then the third, then the fourth. The gardener froze mid-trim. The maid dropped her glass. The estate's air felt different now, denser, like something sacred or dangerous had entered. Celeste stepped back from the window, her phone still in hand, blinking. There were no meetings scheduled, no security alerts, no state visits. She felt her pulse skip. Not fear, at least not yet, but confusion, the kind that cracks porcelain certainty with the first tap. She moved behind her lace curtain, careful not to be seen, and watched as doors began to open. From each vehicle emerged not men in black suits, not operatives or reporters, but people with presence. People who didn't need to announce power because it came with them. A tall black woman, in a navy pantsuit, stepped out of the lead vehicle. Her hair was styled into an elegant coil, her gaze sharp as etched glass. She held a manila envelope under one arm like it carried weight that wasn't paper. Behind her, a man in uniform stepped from another SUV, broad-chested, thick-bearded, with a sheriff's badge on his belt and a calm intensity in his eyes. He said nothing, just looked around, then nodded to himself, like he recognized the land. Others followed. A tech magnate in sneakers, and a charcoal blazer, earbuds tucked into one ear. A pastor whose sermons had once aired nationally. A businesswoman who walked with a cane carved from cherrywood. All of them people the world knew by success, but whom Shaq knew by survival. Celeste's heartbeat now thudded in her ears. She didn't understand. These weren't government agents. They weren't protesters. They weren't paparazzi. They were something else. The kind of people who don't arrive without a purpose. The kind who, when they show up together, change the shape of a day, or a life. A knock came, not at her front door, but at the gate, from a man wearing a long brown coat and sunglasses despite the sun hiding behind clouds. He spoke through the intercom, his voice smooth but firm. "Ms. Vangrier, we're here on behalf of Donovan Shaquille O'Neal. No threats. No noise. Just time to talk." She stared at the intercom panel like it had betrayed her. That name, Shaquille O'Neal. It hadn't even clicked at first. In her world he was a distant figure, a known name. A large man from the wrong side of town, who despite his strange popularity and inexplicable wealth, stayed outside her radar. She'd heard of the foundations, the community centers, the speeches he sometimes gave to inner-city youth, but they existed in her mind like legends, useful in conversation, irrelevant in reality. Now his name was on her lawn. She didn't answer the intercom. Instead, she stepped away, her robe fluttering around her ankles. She walked back into her living room, pacing, lips pressed into a single hard line. Her phone buzzed. Unknown number. She didn't answer. The SUVs didn't move. The people stood calmly. No demands. No threats. Just presence. Celeste turned to her assistant, who had finally arrived after navigating the congested security checkpoint now stationed by the estate's front. "What is this?" she asked, voice cracking despite herself. Her assistant looked terrified. I don't know, but they're saying it's connected to Mr. O'Neal. Something about a response. A meeting. "Tell them to leave," Celeste said, almost snarling. They're not doing anything. They're just waiting." Outside, the woman with the manila envelope stepped forward and placed it gently on the stone column at the front gate. No guards approached her. No shouts. She simply looked up toward the security camera and said, "We believe in grace. But we don't believe in silence." Then she walked back to her SUV and waited. Inside the envelope was not a lawsuit, not a threat, but a record. Photos, testimonials, invoices paid, names of people Celeste knew, donors, neighbors, colleagues, whose lives had intersected with Big Shaq in ways she had never imagined. A note attached, handwritten. "We do not ask for apology. We ask for accountability." Celeste read it all. The photos of him kneeling beside sick children in the hospital wing her family had helped build, but never visited. Receipts showing how he'd paid for meals, her gala claimed to fund. A timeline showing how her own father had benefited from Shaq's silent investment during a financial collapse no one else had known about. It all folded together like an elegant dagger. She sat, legs trembling slightly beneath her robe. Outside, the sheriff stepped forward this time, not to issue a warrant, but to deliver a story. He spoke calmly into a microphone. The estate's security system picked up. It broadcast straight into the home's interior feed. I was 17. Juvenile record. Petty theft. No future. I was headed for prison when a man named Donovan sat me down, paid off my debt, and told me I was worth more than my worst mistake. Today I wear this badge because of him, and I'm here now because when mud hits a man like that, it hits all of us. The words rang through her marble hallways like wind through a cathedral. Celeste didn't speak for a long time. She couldn't. The room felt too large now. Too fragile. Her empire, the world of polished facades and strategic gestures, had collided with something she didn't understand: organic reverence. Earned, not bought. She had believed Willcroft respected her because of her name. Now she realized it tolerated her because of its silence, and the silence had just shattered. By evening, the SUVs had not left. They simply waited. She finally stepped outside, this time clothed, composed, holding her chin high, but her eyes darted. She approached the gate. The envelope was gone, but the meaning remained. No violence, no destruction, no confrontation. But the message was crystal. You were seen, you were wrong, and now what you do next defines who you truly are. And in the distance, though she could not see him, Celeste sensed what Oak Ridge already knew. When Big Shaq says nothing, the whole world listens harder. Long before the Bentleys, before the convoys rolled in, before Celeste Vangrier's name became a quiet warning in Wilcroft's side streets, there was a man walking alone with a weight few saw. Donovan Big, Shaquille O'Neal, millionaire by bank account, wealthy by conscience, never cared much for ceremony. While others built legacies in glass towers, Shaq built his in the quiet moments, the kind that never made the news but made lives whole again. And yet, despite all that he gave, no statue stood in his name, no street bore his initials. He didn't need it, because some men plant in silence and let the world eat in harvest. There wasn't a ledger anyone could find in his home, no Excel sheet, no locked drawer. But there was a ledger, not written in ink, but in memory, in whispered gratitude, in second chances, the kind of ledger that breathed in the spaces where shame once lived, and now dignity had returned. The first entry wasn't financial. It was a promise. Years ago, a boy named Devon Tiller had been caught stealing an energy drink and a bag of chips from DeMarco's corner store. First offense, scared eyes, angry mother. The clerk wanted to press charges. The system was ready to mark him for life. But Shaq happened to be standing outside, talking to DeMarco about food drive logistics. He saw the panic in Devon's face. He saw a reflection of boys he'd once grown up with. Boys who never made it past their first mistake. So he stepped in, paid for the items, pulled Devon aside, and asked him one question. You want to be a cautionary tale or a comeback story? 2 years later, Devon graduated high school. 3 years after that, he opened Tiller Auto Spa, one of the most profitable detailing shops in the county. Ask him who funded it. He'll say a silent investor. But he keeps a photo of Shaq on his office wall, not framed, not centered, just taped to the side of a filing cabinet, like a compass. The next entry was a home. A modest, single-story house with a rusted porch swing and a leaking roof. It belonged to Miss Rutha May, a retired teacher who once taught Shaq's mother how to read novels with purpose. Her mortgage company had been circling like vultures, legal notices piling up, her pension too small to fight back. The town talked about helping. Shaq didn't talk. He simply wired the money to the lender through a legal trust, wiped the debt, and left a note in her mailbox. Thank you for seeing what others didn't. Rutha May never found out who saved her home, until years later when she joined a board meeting for the Wilcroft Literacy Initiative and saw Shaq in the back of the room, quietly taking notes. Their eyes met. She smiled. He nodded. That was all. But not every story was so neat. Some were messy, raw, wounds still open. Delroy Knox had been a name whispered in back alleys. Once a dealer, a thief, a threat. Most folks had written him off. One too many court appearances. One too many bruises. But Shaq didn't look at Delroy's record. He looked at his potential. He found him half drunk behind the Wilcroft bus station. Offered him 2 things. A bed in a clean halfway house. And a job cataloging inventory at one of Shaq's warehouses. No fanfare. No pity. Just a chance. Delroy took it. He relapsed once, twice. But Shaq never raised his voice. Just adjusted the support. By the 3rd year, Delroy had a GED, a savings account, and a role managing the entire East Side logistics hub. These weren't handouts. They were hand-ups. Measured. Intentional. Quiet. Celeste Vangrier never knew these stories. She lived on the other side of them. The side that counted grants and red carpet galas as justice. To her, justice was structured, delivered through policy, filtered through committees and donor dinners. But to Shaq, justice was what you did when no one was looking. When you didn't expect a return on kindness. When you gave people the right to believe in themselves again. It wasn't that he hated money. He respected it. But he never trusted it. Money had a way of making people feel exempt, like decency was for sale. And Wilcroft had long been split by that invisible fence. Those who used money as leverage, and those who used it as liberation. Shaq was the latter. The people who stepped out of those SUVs were living proof. Etta Monroe, who once cleaned motel rooms off Route 19, and now sat on the boards of 3 national firms, had never forgotten the man who bought her kids asthma medicine when she couldn't, when no one else would. He didn't know her name back then. He just saw her in the Rite Aid aisle, counted her tears instead of her wallet, and told the pharmacist, "Put it on me." Sheriff Dwayne Harmon, now the most respected lawman in 3 counties, once stood at the edge of a criminal career. His older brother took the fall for something Dwayne did. Shaq knew the truth, but never used it. Instead, he called Dwayne's bluff, got him into Willcroft Community College, introduced him to a mentor, helped him channel rage into reform. Now Dwayne walks a path that began with mercy. And then there was Reverend Royce, whose fall from grace had been front-page material. The overdose, the tabloid scandal, the disappearance. What no one ever knew was that during that dark descent, a man named Shaq showed up at his motel door, not with a camera crew, not with a sermon, but with a bag of groceries, clean clothes, and a car ride to a rehab center 2 states away. Royce came back from hell. Now he helps others walk away from the same fire. And he tells them the truth. "I met God once. He was wearing Timberlands and smelled like laundry soap." These stories weren't accidents. They were a pattern, a map of how change really happens. Not from podiums, but porches. Not in headlines, but handshakes. So when Shaq saw Celeste Fangrier, that day through the mud-speckled windshield, he didn't just see a rude woman in a luxury car. He saw a culture of dismissal. A world built on smiling over injustice, waving away the weight of consequence with perfectly lacquered fingernails. But what made it worse wasn't the act. It was the indifference. And so the people he helped returned not to destroy Celeste, but to teach her. They came bearing proof. Not legal demands, but living evidence. Faces she didn't recognize. Voices she never heard. And they each came with one shared mission: to show her that money cannot measure grace. That philanthropy is empty without humility. That being a good person on paper means nothing when you refuse to see the humanity standing in front of you. They didn't yell at her. They didn't shame her. They offered her perspective. The ledger Shaq kept wasn't about favors owed. It was about balance restored. And every person in that convoy was a walking page from that book. Celeste had thrown mud on more than fabric. She had splashed a community's reflection, dirtied it with her carelessness.
Now she had a choice.
Not to apologize for the splash, but to answer for the blindness. To learn what dignity feels like when it isn't wrapped in status. To understand that what Donovan Shaquille O'Neal built could never be splashed away, because it wasn't written in ink. It was written in people. Celeste Vangrier had always felt in control of the narrative. In her world, perception was the gatekeeper of power. Her name was synonymous with elegance. Her presence always accompanied by approval nods and curated applause. So when the invitation arrived, an embossed letter delivered in person by a discreet messenger dressed in tailored black, she didn't question it. Willcroft Philanthropic Roundtable, Private Leadership Summit, location undisclosed. The language was rich with exclusivity. The tone struck her ego like a familiar song. She accepted, of course, not out of curiosity, but necessity. After the SUV incident, what she privately referred to as the driveway display, she had begun to feel the shifts. Invitations slowed. Calls lingered awkwardly. Eyes that once met her with polished warmth now carried a hint of caution. The town hadn't turned on her, but it had leaned back, and Celeste knew the smell of a cooling brand. She arrived at the summit by chauffeured sedan, dressed in a crisp pearl blouse and slate gray suit. Her heels clicked confidently against the cobbled path of Vesper Hollow, a secluded estate nestled between old-growth trees and silence. The grounds had no banners, no photographers, no visible staff, just a heavy oak door that opened before she could knock. A man stood inside, tall with weathered eyes, and the stillness of someone who had already said everything worth saying. He offered no introduction, only a gesture toward a long hallway. She walked in, unsure whether this was a meeting or a test. The air smelled of cedar and old books. The floors were polished stone. Along the corridor, framed photographs lined the walls. But not of art or achievement. These were faces, moments, stories caught in still frames. A voice came through the intercom above, calm and slow. "Welcome to the Chamber of Echoes." Celeste paused, brow narrowing. "No one is here to shame you, only to remind you." The first room opened, with a quiet hum. She stepped in. Projected onto the wall was an old video, grainy, unfiltered, A woman, mid-40s, dressed in hospital scrubs. Her voice thick with fatigue, speaking to a camera in what appeared to be a counseling session. I applied for a housing grant 6 times, kept getting denied. My boss said I didn't look the part of someone who'd bring the right kind of PR. That boss was on a board chaired by Ms. Celeste Vangrier. I cleaned their offices every Friday. The room fell quiet. A second wall lit up with text overlays, emails, board meeting minutes, Celeste's own digital fingerprint denying the application, citing image sensitivity. She turned away. A door slid open, without prompt. The second room was darker, filled with audio recordings. Not shouts, just moments. A conversation between 2 waitstaff during a gala. One recounted how Celeste had demanded they move the darker-skinned servers to the back for photo symmetry. The audio paused, then replayed. The words crisp, clinical, not hateful, but indifferent. The kind that cuts deeper because it believes itself innocent. She stepped back. The voice returned. We don't show you to humiliate you, only to help you see what you've been blind to. Celeste bristled. This is a manipulation, she muttered to herself. But she kept walking. In the third room, a young girl appeared on the screen, maybe 14, speaking with a maturity earned too early. My scholarship application was dropped. They said my zip code flagged me as high risk, said they didn't want to waste opportunity on instability. The foundation? It had Celeste Vangrier's name on the check. Celeste flinched. That wasn't personal. That was policy. She didn't handle the day-to-day. She couldn't have known. The girl's voice echoed. But you did know, you just didn't care enough to ask. There was no door this time. Just a hallway filled with mirrors, not pristine ones, distorted, cracked in places. As Celeste walked, her own reflection multiplied. In one mirror she appeared younger, smiling as she handed a check to a camera. In another she looked cold, brushing past a janitor. In another she was sitting at a fundraiser table, laughing at a joke made at someone else's expense. Each reflection whispered, not words, but reminders, the small moments that had never meant anything to her, but meant everything to someone else. At the end of the corridor was a final room. Plain, empty. A single chair sat in the center. She entered slowly. A screen blinked to life in front of her. It showed Shaq, but not the man she saw in passing. Not the man covered in mud. This was Donovan, sitting on a wooden bench, his hands folded, eyes steady. He spoke without venom, without blame. I don't expect an apology. I don't need your tears. But you've lived a life where the world changed shape to make you comfortable. That's not your fault. But staying blind? That is. He paused, looked directly at the lens. Justice ain't about payback. It's about course correction. Then the screen went black. The door opened behind her. No guards. No judgment. Just stillness. When she stepped outside, the air felt colder. Waiting at the gates of Vesper Hollow were the same SUVs. But this time, they weren't there for message or presence. This time they were there with intention. The tall woman who had once held the manila envelope stood beside the first vehicle. This time she held a dossier, not on Celeste but for her. Inside you'll find a list of names, people your decisions have impacted. You don't have to fix it all, but you do have to start somewhere. Celeste didn't reach for the file. Not yet. The woman didn't push. This isn't punishment. This is invitation. Behind her, the convoy began to load. The sheriff tipped his hat. The pastor gave a nod. They weren't angry. They weren't lingering. They had delivered the mirror. What Celeste chose to do with the reflection that was hers now. She stood in silence as the last SUV pulled away, dust rising behind them like a soft warning. The file remained at her feet, and somewhere in the distance, in a town still watching, still whispering, the echoes waited to see if this time she would finally listen. Celeste Vangrier stepped through the threshold of Donovan Shaquille O'Neal's estate, not with fear, but with calculation. The house was nothing like she expected. No excessive luxury, no framed accolades, no curated gallery of influence. The walls were painted in earthy tones. The floor creaked like it remembered where it came from. The light filtered in not through ornate chandeliers, but through wide open windows framed by linen curtains that moved with the breeze. It felt like a place that held stories, not possession. She had not been summoned, not explicitly. After the chamber of echoes and the envelope of names left at her feet, no one had told her what to do next. Yet here she was, in front of the estate that the town once called myth, guided by something deeper than guilt, a need to understand. Her driver had remained at the gate, as instructed. She walked the final stretch alone, heels sinking gently into the gravel of the winding path. The door opened before she could knock. No one stood there. She stepped in, instinctively smoothing her jacket, chin high. But something inside her had shifted. The performative poise felt heavy now, like borrowed armor that no longer fit. A hallway stretched before her, lined with framed photographs. Unlike the curated images in her own estate, these weren't press-ready. They were real muddy kids grinning with missing teeth, families caught mid-laughter on porches, elders holding graduation portraits of their great-grandchildren. Life, unfiltered. At the end of the hallway, a wide wooden door stood slightly ajar. She pushed it open and entered the mirror room. The name wasn't metaphorical. The walls were lined with thin vertical mirrors, each pane slightly warped at the edges, not in a decorative way, but in a way that invited introspection. They didn't reflect her as she saw herself, but as she was tired, guarded, unsure. In the center of the room was a semicircle of tall display screens. They weren't arranged to impress, but to immerse. The floor dipped slightly into a sunken space, and as she stepped into the middle, the screens flickered to life.
At first, just silence.
Then a voice, clear, measured, female. Begin playback. File entry 1. Subject Evelyn Ross. The screen lit up with the face of a middle-aged black woman. She was seated at a kitchen table, her hands folded over a notebook filled with bills and penciled-in meal plans. She wasn't crying, her voice didn't waver, but her words were heavy with fatigue. My son didn't get into the gifted program. Said we didn't have the right parental advocacy. That's code, you know? Means we didn't speak the same language at the PTA meetings. Means I showed up in scrubs, and not slacks. You sat on the school board then, voted for that curriculum shift, said we needed to elevate standards. But you never looked down to see who you were stepping over. The screen went dark. Celeste stood frozen. The next screen lit up. Playback. Entry 2. Subject Antoine Ledger. This time, a black man in his 60s, sleeves rolled up, grease under his nails, a mechanic by trade. He was sitting on a milk crate in front of his garage, chain smoking. I fixed your damn Bentley twice. You said thank you. Handed me a check without looking me in the eye. Your assistant called later. Said I should be grateful you paid full price. Never thought much of it. Until my son got stopped 2 blocks from here, driving a clean car. Officer said he fit the description. You spoke at that fundraiser about community policing, but you didn't speak to us. The screen dimmed again. Celeste's mouth opened slightly, but no words came. Her hand twitched at her side, unsure whether to defend or surrender. Then a child appeared. Playback. Entry 3. Subject, Micah Lewis. Age, a boy, sitting cross-legged on a living room floor, his shirt a little too big, hair freshly braided. My mama said some people don't see us 'cause we too close to the ground. Said some lady in a white car, made fun of my sneakers once. They was clean, just not new. Mama cried in the car after. I told her I didn't care, but I did. I really did. The screen faded. Celeste sank onto the edge of a cushioned bench near the display. She wasn't crying, not yet, but her chest felt tight, like the air around her had thickened. She had known about poverty, about urban challenges, about equity. She had sat through board meetings, read the grant reports, nodded at every statistical breakdown, but she had never heard this, never felt it press against her skin like static. These weren't anecdotes. They were indictments, not of her direct cruelty, but of her indifference. And perhaps that was worse. The next screen showed an elderly couple. They sat side by side on a porch, a warm evening breeze ruffling the lace curtains behind them. Playback. Entry 4. Subject Wallace and Loretta Giles. Wallace spoke first. She cut our funding, said the historical archive wasn't culturally significant enough. We were preserving Black Willcroft history. Pictures from Reconstruction, oral stories, land deeds our ancestors fought to keep. She called it redundant. Loretta added, we mailed her the album. It came back. Returned to sender, unopened. Celeste felt her breath catch. She remembered that letter, or at least the assistant's note about it. She'd tossed it into the trash with 3 others. Too niche, too messy. Then came the final file. Playback. Entry 5. Subject, Donovan O'Neill. The screen did not show Shaq's face this time. Instead, it panned slowly across a photo of a community mural. A pair of hands reaching upward. Below them, you cannot pretend to love a place if you do not first love its people. Then his voice, calm, low. No one becomes a villain, in their own mind. You probably don't think you've done harm. But when you refuse to see others fully, you shrink them in your world. And in shrinking them, you give yourself permission to act like their pain is smaller too. That's how systems stay standing, not because of evil, but because of comfortable silence. Celeste lowered her head, not from shame, from weight, because for the first time she wasn't being accused. She was being reflected. The final screen went dark. The room returned to silence. She rose slowly, glancing around the mirrors once more. This time, the distortions didn't mock her. They invited her to sit with her discomfort, to realize that her legacy wouldn't be defined by how many libraries she named, or checkbooks she emptied, but by whether she ever learned how to listen. At the door, a single envelope had been placed on a small wooden stand. She opened it. Inside was one line handwritten in steady ink. You've seen what you need to. Now decide who you want to be. She left the mirror room in silence. The mirrors did not follow her, but their truths did. The sun was lowering itself across the fields of Willcroft, draping gold over the rooftops and bending light into the long windows of Donovan Big Big. Shaquille O'Neal's estate. Inside, the quiet pulsed, not with tension, but with a kind of holy stillness. It had been 3 days since Celeste Vangrier left the mirror room. 3 days of silence. No calls, no press, no movement from the estate. Not a single SUV had stirred. Then, on the 4th morning, she received a note, handwritten, delivered by someone she didn't recognize, but who wore an expression that told her this was no social call. No heading, no signature, just a time, and a line of instructions. Come alone. Wear nothing expensive. Leave titles at the door. She arrived just after noon. She wore black slacks and a gray blouse, both modest and simple. No earrings, no makeup, her hair tied back. The estate door opened before she reached for the bell. A quiet nod greeted her, and then she was led through the hallway again, but not to the mirror room. Today she was taken deeper, past the photographs and the screens, into a side of the house few had ever seen. The room was warm, not in temperature, but in presence. Wood-paneled walls, worn leather chairs, a fireplace unlit but scented with ash and cedar. And there he sat, Shaq. He rose slowly, not like a man trying to impress but like a man who honored stillness. He was wearing a deep olive shirt, sleeves rolled to the elbows and dark denim pants. No watch, no jewelry, just presence. He extended a hand. She hesitated, but took it. Have a seat, Celeste, he said, gesturing to the chair across from him. There was no formality, no hostility, just clarity in his tone. The kind of clarity that had traveled through every eye that had once looked away from her, and now landed directly, without flinching. She sat, her back straight, her hands folded in her lap. Shaq leaned forward, elbows on his knees. I didn't ask you here to forgive you, he said calmly. This isn't about forgiveness. She nodded, barely audible. I understand. This is about repair. He slid a file across the small table between them. She reached for it and opened it, expecting another ledger of past sins, another mirror of unintended harm. But what she saw instead caught her off guard. Blueprints, business plans, endowment outlines, a draft proposal. At the top, the Willcroft Equity Trust. Below it, the subtitle, A Foundation for Restoring Access, Opportunity, and Justice, funded in perpetuity. Shaq watched her eyes move across the paper, then spoke with measured grace. This isn't about your guilt. It's about your choice. You've built walls in this town. Now I'm offering you a blueprint to build bridges. Celeste flipped through the documents. The foundation's purpose was clear: to fund scholarships specifically for children who had been redlined out of good schools, to offer business grants to entrepreneurs blocked from credit because of zip codes, to invest in historical preservation projects for Black communities in Willcroft that had been erased or whitewashed over the decades. The amount required was more than generous. It was unignorable. Celeste looked up. You want me to fund all this?
No.
Shaq said gently. I want you to stand behind it. Not just write the check, not just attend the gala. I want your name on it, but this time not to control it, to surrender it. Let others lead. Let those you once overlooked become the architect. Her throat tightened. This wasn't a transaction. It was a reckoning with her own ego. And if I say no? She asked. Shaq didn't blink. Then the town will know everything. What you did, what you didn't do, what you refused to face. Celeste felt the room change. Not darker, just clearer, like fog lifting to reveal the edge of a cliff. You're threatening me. I'm offering you the truth, he replied, steady. You saw the mirror room. You heard those stories. You know this isn't about a puddle. It never was. It's about who you believed you were compared to everyone else. What I'm giving you now is a door out of that illusion. She looked back down at the file. The numbers, the plans, the permanence of what it implied. You want me to do this as penance? No, Shaq said. As proof. She sat back, closing the folder slowly. And what happens after? What do I get in return? Shaq tilted his head slightly, not in judgment, but in quiet disbelief. You get to be useful, Celeste. For the first time in a long time. The silence between them settled like sediment. Not heavy, just honest. She was quiet for a moment longer, then lifted her eyes. Will they believe I mean it? He nodded once. They'll believe what you build, not what you say. Celeste exhaled, long and unguarded. I'll do it. Shaq didn't smile. He simply rose. Then let's begin. He walked to the door and opened it. As she stood and turned to leave, he added without facing her. One more thing. She stopped. If you try to control this, if you try to make it about you again, those power players outside, the ones you ignored until they parked on your lawn, they won't stay quiet next time. Neither will I. She looked at him. No anger, just truth. And for the first time in a long time, Celeste Vangrier didn't argue. She just nodded, then stepped into the light. The sky above Willcroft carried a softer hue that morning, the kind of blue that didn't demand attention but earned it, gently. It wasn't the same town it had been just weeks ago. Something had shifted, not in the structures or signage, but in the rhythm, slower in some places, steadier in others. Magnolia Lane, once a corridor of indifference between privilege and poverty, now pulsed with subtle change. And today that change arrived in a vehicle far different than the one that had made this street infamous. A white community van, sides painted with the logo of the Willcroft Equity Trust, just days old, but already moving, rolled to a slow stop by the cracked curb where a splash had once drawn invisible lines between two worlds. The engine cut off, and for a moment, there was just stillness. Then the door opened. Celeste Vangrier stepped down, her polished heels replaced by sneakers. No designer coat, no entourage, no schedule, just a canvas tote filled with warm containers of food, and hands no longer manicured to perfection, but worn enough to serve without hesitation. She scanned the street as she stepped forward. The once potholed sidewalks had been patched since the Trust's emergency repair grant. The rec center across the block bore a new awning now, its nameplate etched with names not of donors, but of residents. She didn't look at it for validation. She looked at it because she wanted to remember who it belonged to. This wasn't an announcement of redemption. There were no news vans, no gala photographers trailing her. This was the slow walk back to humanity, a walk that had to begin where the mud had dried and pride had nearly drowned her. The van's side door slid open with a soft creak, and out came foldable crates filled with meals, chicken and rice, some mac and cheese, juice boxes and apples. Not prepared by a catering firm, but by volunteers she had shared kitchen space with the night before. Real sweat, real noise, real names. She had chopped onions and blistered her fingers on steam trays, without complaint. Somewhere in the laughter of those hours, she had stopped thinking of herself as the host, and started thinking of herself as the help. It felt better that way. She began moving down the sidewalk, offering warm meals with a voice that was quieter now, not demure, just less performative. She didn't ask for smiles. She didn't give inspirational quotes. She just asked, "Would you like some lunch today?" And they responded, because the people of Magnolia Lane hadn't needed her to become someone else. They just needed her to finally show up as a person. At the end of the block, 3 kids ran up, 2 girls and a boy, their backpacks slung crooked across their shoulders. They weren't starstruck. They weren't skeptical. They were curious.
You that lady from the TV?
The boy asked, wiping ketchup from his lip. Celeste crouched to his height and smiled, not out of habit, but out of recognition. Not anymore. I'm just someone helping with lunch. The girl beside him nudged her friend. She got nice shoes for somebody giving out chicken. Celeste chuckled. They're not that nice. I got 'em on sale. The kids laughed. Not with sarcasm, but inclusion. And in that moment, she understood something vital. You can't buy belonging. You have to earn it with consistency. As they ran off with their meals, she stood again, brushing her hands off on her pants. Across the street, past the parked cars and cracked curb, someone stood beside a low garden fence, arms folded. Shaq. Not big, not the myth, not the legend, just Donovan, in a plain tee and work boots, holding a mug in one hand, his other resting on the fence post. His face unreadable, but not closed, his eyes steady, watching not just her movements, but her intent. He hadn't come to interrupt, hadn't stepped forward to test or scold, he was simply there. Their eyes met. She didn't raise her hand in a wave. He didn't nod yet. They stood in stillness for just a beat too long. But it wasn't awkward. It was deliberate. A recognition, not of resolution, but of readiness. Then slowly, Shaq nodded. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't ceremonial. But to Celeste it was everything. It was permission to continue. The kind that can't be demanded. Only offered. She nodded back, chest catching on a breath she didn't realize she'd been holding. Not because he forgave her, but because he saw she had started earning the right to keep showing up. She turned back to the van. There were still crates to unload, meals to distribute, hands to reach, names to learn. This was only the beginning. The offering she'd accepted wasn't a one-time payment. It was a long-term contract with accountability as its only currency. Behind her, a woman from the porch of a yellow duplex called out, "Miss Vangrier, you coming up here next?" Celeste smiled. "Absolutely, be right there." And as she crossed the street, the old lines drawn in that infamous splash began to dissolve. Not with an apology, not with a headline, but with each step that came without expectation of reward. Magnolia Lane didn't forget. But now it didn't flinch either. It watched. And it waited. Because change, real change, doesn't roar in. It returns quietly, hands full, eyes forward, ready to serve. The late afternoon sun washed over Willcroft like a blessing that didn't need to announce itself. The light filtered through pecan branches, glinted off the surface of rain barrels, warmed the steps of churches and the windows of duplexes once overlooked. A breeze moved through the streets, not urgent, not performative, just steady, like the new rhythm of a town that had finally learned to listen to itself. Change had come, not with riots or grand pronouncements, but with something quieter, deeper. And at the edge of it all, tucked behind the old iron gate that had never been locked, sat a house with wide eaves and a porch full of flower boxes. The home didn't rise above the skyline or shimmer with wealth, but if you asked anyone in Willcroft where the heartbeat of their new beginning lived, they would point here, the estate of Donovan Big, Shaquille O'Neal, though no one called it that. They just called it his place, because a man like Shaq didn't need marble plaques or heralded entryways. He needed a garden, and that's where he was, kneeling in a bed of soil, fingers caked in the scent of tomatoes and summer squash, a soft smile resting on his face, not the public kind, but the kind that settles into you when the harvest arrives, and you remember how deep you had to plant to make anything grow. The man once mistaken as a myth now looked entirely human. Boots dusty, t-shirt faded, knees groaning softly as he leaned over the roots. The SUVs were gone, their tires no longer imprinting messages on his gravel drive. The mansion was quiet, its rooms now used for planning, for counseling, for teaching, not for spectacle. From this small patch of earth, Shaq had watched Willcroft bloom. Not perfectly, not without thorns, but truly. At the library, there was now a permanent wing funded by the Equity Trust, overseen by a board made up entirely of residents from the east and south sides. Across from the community center, a mural had been painted by local teens, hands of every shade forming a circle, no single figure in the center. They titled it The Unseen Crown. The trust had done more than anyone expected. It had paid off student lunch debts, repaired long-neglected roads, bought new instruments for the band programs. It created fellowships for formerly incarcerated men who wanted to start again. And Celeste had become something else entirely. Not a savior, not a symbol, just a servant with good knees and open ears. Someone who showed up when she said she would, and didn't need the mic when she did. None of that had come from Shaq demanding anything. He never gave speeches on accountability, never called press conferences. He simply continued being exactly who he'd always been. Present, grounded, relentless in his quiet work. His daughter, Myra, now a practicing civil rights attorney, had moved back to Willcroft part-time, taking on cases from her father's study, setting up a legal clinic that operated out of the back of the old firehouse. His mother, Lucille, still ran the garden club, but now, half the town showed up to meetings, not to grow plants, but to listen to her read Baldwin aloud, while they pulled weeds. As Shaq planted the last row for the season, he heard the rustle of bike wheels along the gravel. Two neighborhood kids, Troy and Kennedy, waved at him as they passed. He raised a muddy glove and grinned. They waved harder. They had no idea how many papers Shaq had signed, how many accounts he had funded under anonymous trusts. They just knew him as Mr. Shaq, who kept freeze pops in his garage fridge, and who could fix a flat bike tire in 4 minutes flat. That's how he liked it. Because Donovan Shaquille O'Neal had never needed a crown. He had only ever wanted to build a world where no one else had to wear a burden just to feel seen. Back inside the house, an old clock ticked steady. On a shelf above the fireplace sat a faded notebook, the kind you buy in bulk, college ruled, corners bent. Inside it were names, not of those who owed him, but those he owed his strength to. Teachers, friends, strangers who had offered mercy when he didn't deserve it. That list was long. It always grew, and he read from it sometimes, aloud, to remind himself who he was accountable to. Grace, he believed, was a circle, not a ladder. That afternoon he received a visitor.
Not one of power.
Just Wallace Giles, the man from the porch, the historian, now curator of the Willcroft Community Archive. He brought an envelope containing a single photo recently restored, a shot of Shaq, maybe 23, pushing a cart of supplies into the old rec center, with a busted shoe and a determined look. Wallace held it out. This belongs in the town exhibit. But it started with you. Shaq looked at the photo, smiled slow. Nah, he said. It started with what I remembered when no one else did. Wallace nodded. Still, it's going up. Shaq didn't argue. Just nodded once and held the picture for a while. Like it weighed more than a frame. When Wallace left, Shaq stepped out again onto the porch. Dusk had started its work, cooling the earth, lengthening the shadows. A group of volunteers were unloading crates across the street, meals for the after-school program. One of them looked up. Celeste. She met his eyes. No performance, just acknowledgement. She tipped her chin. He tipped his back. And that was enough. Because the Crown people wanted to give him the public accolades, the magazine features, the Shaq Day resolutions. He had turned all of it down, not out of modesty, but out of clarity. If you wear a crown too long, people forget they can build their own. And so Shaq remained in the soil, in the streets, in the quiet folds of Willcroft's Renaissance. The town moved forward not because he had led them loudly, but because he had stood still with unshakable purpose, long enough for others to find their own balance. Years from now, children will grow up never knowing there was a time their community was divided by invisible gates and private glances. They'll play in parks named after local heroes whose stories they will hear not from textbooks but from neighbors. And Shaq's name will appear on a bench plaque, maybe, or a scholarship certificate, not as a monument but as a reminder. A man who never asked for a crown, because he had already planted a kingdom. She splashed mud on a man she didn't recognize, and drove off like it meant nothing. But the next morning, 40 blacked-out SUVs rolled up her driveway, each carrying a truth she never saw coming. No police, no press, just power and quiet debt, finally calling in. Because when a humble man with a past gets disrespected, the whole town remembers who he really is. And this time, silence won't save her.